My name is Victoria. I'm 28 years old, and I need to tell you something that completely changed my perspective on life. What I'm about to share with you, I've never told anyone before, not even my closest friends. It's a story that started with arrogance and ended with the most profound lesson I've ever learned. I was born into wealth. My grandfather built a real estate empire from scratch, and my father expanded it across 3 states. By the time I inherited the family business, we owned dozens of properties, including a mansion that had been in our family for generations. This wasn't just any house. It was a sprawling estate with marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and gardens that stretched as far as the eye could see. I thought I deserved it all, simply because of my last name. Growing up privileged, I developed an attitude that I'm not proud of today. I believed that money made me superior to others, that my expensive education and designer clothes somehow made me more intelligent, more worthy than people who worked with their hands or struggled to make ends meet. I looked down on street vendors, thinking they were lazy or unintelligent for not finding real jobs. How wrong I was, and how much that mindset was about to cost me. The day that changed everything started like any other. I was walking through the downtown area after a business meeting, feeling particularly arrogant because I'd just closed $1 million deal. The autumn air was crisp, and I was admiring my reflection in store windows, adjusting my $1,000 designer blazer. That's when I saw him, an elderly man sitting behind a small wooden table, selling what looked like handmade puzzles and brain teasers. But what happened next would shatter everything I thought I knew about intelligence, worth, and what it truly means to be successful. The encounter that followed didn't just humble me, it completely destroyed my worldview and rebuilt it from the ground up. The old man looked up at me with eyes that seemed to hold decades of wisdom. His clothes were simple but clean, his hands weathered from years of craftsmanship. Something about his calm demeanor irritated me. Here I was, young, successful, wealthy, and this street vendor was looking at me as if we were equals. My arrogance kicked in immediately. "Interesting little toys you have there," I said, with a condescending smile, picking up one of his wooden puzzles. It was beautifully crafted, with intricate pieces that fit together in what seemed like an impossible way. Despite myself, I was impressed by the craftsmanship, but I wasn't about to let him know that. The vendor smiled gently. "They're not toys, miss. They're puzzles that challenge the mind in ways most people never experience. Each one is designed to test different types of intelligence, spatial reasoning, logical thinking, pattern recognition." I laughed, a sound that even to my own ears sounded cruel. "Intelligence, please. I have an MBA from Harvard and I run a multi-million-dollar company. I think I know a thing or two about intelligence." I set the puzzle down carelessly. "How much do these cost? Maybe I'll buy one for my nephew. Kids love simple games like this." But what the old man said next stopped me in my tracks. "You know, young lady, true intelligence isn't measured by degrees or bank accounts. It's measured by wisdom, empathy, and the ability to see beyond surface appearances." I felt my cheeks flush with anger. Who was this nobody to lecture me about intelligence? But before I could respond with the cutting remark forming on my tongue, something happened that would change the course of this entire encounter. The old man reached into a wooden box beside him and pulled out a puzzle unlike any of the others. It was made of what appeared to be ancient wood, dark and polished smooth by countless hands. The pieces seemed to shift and shimmer in the afternoon light, creating optical illusions that made my head spin just looking at it. "This," he said, softly, "is special. I've had it for 40 years, and in all that time, only 3 people have ever solved it." His weathered fingers traced the intricate patterns carved into its surface. "Each person who solved it taught me something profound about the nature of intelligence and humility." My competitive nature flared up immediately. I had always been the smartest person in any room, the one who could solve problems others couldn't even comprehend. 3 people in 40 years. That's it, I scoffed. "Let me guess, you're about to tell me it's impossible for someone like me to solve?" The vendor's eyes twinkled with something that looked almost like amusement. "Not impossible, just revealing. This puzzle doesn't test what you know. It tests who you are." I reached for my designer purse, ready to pull out my wallet. "How much? I'll buy it right now and solve it before I reach my car." The arrogance in my voice was so thick, you could cut it with a knife, but I didn't care. I was about to show this simple street vendor what real intelligence looked like. But then he said something that made my blood run cold and changed everything I thought I knew about this harmless encounter. What came out of his mouth next would haunt me for weeks and force me to question everything about myself. The old man looked at me with those penetrating eyes and said, "I don't want your money, miss. I want to make you a wager." He paused, letting the word hang in the air between us like a challenge. "You seem so confident in your intelligence, so certain that your education and success make you superior. Let's put that to the test." I felt a chill run down my spine, but my pride wouldn't let me back down. "What kind of wager?" "If you can solve this puzzle," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'll give you something more valuable than money. I'll give you a story that will change your life. But if you can't solve it, ... he smiled mysteriously. "Well, let's just see what happens." That should have been my first warning. Any rational person would have walked away from such a vague proposition. But my ego was too bruised, my need to prove my superiority too strong. "Fine," I snapped. "But let me make this more interesting. If I solve your little puzzle, you acknowledge that education and success do matter. You admit that some people are simply more intelligent than others." The vendor nodded slowly. "And if you can't solve it," without thinking, driven by pure arrogance and the need to dominate this conversation, I heard myself saying words that would come back to haunt me. "If I can't solve your puzzle, which won't happen, I'll give you my mansion. I'll sign over the deed to you right here, right now." The moment those words left my mouth, I felt something shift in the air around us. Other people walking by seemed to slow down, as if they sensed something significant was happening. The old man's expression grew serious, almost sad. But I still didn't understand what I had just committed myself to, or how this simple street vendor was about to turn my entire world upside down. The vendor reached into his jacket and pulled out a small leather notebook, worn smooth by years of use. "Very well," he said quietly. "But first, let me tell you the rules. You have exactly 1 hour to solve this puzzle. You cannot use any tools, you cannot call for help, and you cannot give up once you begin." I laughed, but it sounded forced even to my own ears. 1 hour? I'll have it solved in 10 minutes. But as I took the puzzle in my hands, something strange happened. The moment my fingers touched the ancient wood, I felt a jolt of electricity run through me, and suddenly the pieces seemed to multiply before my eyes. What had appeared to be a simple wooden puzzle with maybe 15 or 20 pieces now revealed itself to be incredibly complex. There were layers upon layers of interlocking elements, some so small I could barely see them, others that seemed to change shape as I watched. The surface was covered in symbols I didn't recognize, not Chinese, not Arabic, not any language I had ever studied. What kind of puzzle is this?" I stammered, my confidence beginning to crack. The old man sat back in his chair, his eyes never leaving my face. "It's a puzzle that reveals truth, miss. The question is, are you ready to see yours?" I started working frantically, trying every combination I could think of. Minutes ticked by, then 10, then 20. My perfectly manicured nails broke as I struggled with pieces that seemed to mock me with their refusal to fit together. Sweat began to form on my forehead, ruining my expensive makeup. But what terrified me most wasn't the complexity of the puzzle. It was the growing realization that this wasn't just about wooden pieces fitting together. Every time I thought I had found the solution, the puzzle seemed to shift, revealing new layers of complexity that I hadn't seen before. And slowly, horribly, I began to understand that I was in way over my head. 30 minutes passed, then 45. My designer blazer was wrinkled with sweat, my hands were shaking, and I could feel tears of frustration building behind my eyes. The puzzle seemed to be actively fighting against me, pieces sliding apart, just when I thought I had them in the right position. "This is impossible," I whispered, my voice cracking with desperation. "The pieces keep changing, the patterns keep shifting. It's not a fair puzzle." The old man leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. "Life isn't fair either, miss, and the most important lessons we learn rarely come easily." He glanced at an old pocket watch. 15 minutes remaining. Panic set in. For the first time in my privileged life, I was facing the possibility of genuine failure, and the consequences were beyond anything I could have imagined. My mansion, the symbol of everything I was, everything I had inherited, everything that made me superior to people like this street vendor, was about to slip through my fingers. I tried a different approach, forcing myself to slow down and really study the puzzle. That's when I noticed something that made my heart sink even further. Carved into the base of the puzzle, so small I had missed it before, was an inscription in what looked like Latin. My expensive education had included Latin classes, but this phrase was unlike anything I had studied. "What does this say?" I asked desperately, pointing to the inscription. The vendor read it aloud, his pronunciation perfect. "Sapientia, non ex libris, sed ex corde venet." He paused. "Wisdom comes not from books, but from the heart." 5 minutes left. My hands were trembling so badly, I could barely hold the pieces. Everything I had built my identity on, my intelligence, my education, my superiority, was crumbling around me. But what came next would destroy me completely and force me to confront the most painful truth about myself. "Time," the old man said softly. I stared down at the unsolved puzzle in my hands. Pieces scattered across the table like the fragments of my shattered pride. For the first time in my adult life, I had failed completely and utterly. Not only had I failed, but I had staked everything I owned on my ability to succeed. I can't," I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "I can't solve it." The vendor nodded slowly, but there was no triumph in his expression, only compassion. "The puzzle isn't meant to be solved through intelligence alone, Miss. It requires something else entirely." "What?" I asked desperately. "What does it require?" "Humility," he said simply. "The willingness to admit that you don't know everything, that your worth as a human being isn't measured by your ability to be superior to others." I felt something break inside me. All the arrogance, all the pride, all the certainty that had defined my entire existence came crashing down. "I don't understand," I sobbed. "I've always been the smartest person in the room. I've always found a way to win." The old man reached across the table and gently took the puzzle from my trembling hands. "That's your problem, Victoria. You've spent so long trying to be above everyone else that you've forgotten what it means to be human." How did he know my name? I had never introduced myself, never told him anything about who I was. The question died on my lips as I watched him manipulate the puzzle pieces with practiced ease. But what he did next shattered every assumption I had made about this encounter and forced me to confront a truth so devastating I almost couldn't bear it. The old man's weathered fingers moved across the puzzle with impossible grace, and within moments he had it completely solved. But that wasn't what destroyed me. What destroyed me was the realization of how he had solved it. He hadn't used complex, logical reasoning or advanced spatial intelligence. He had simply felt his way through it. His fingers had found each piece's proper place through intuition, through a deep understanding that went far beyond intellectual knowledge. "How long did that take you to learn?" I asked, my voice barely audible. 43 years, he replied quietly. "I created this puzzle when I was your age, Miss. I was just like you then, arrogant, certain of my superiority, convinced that my intellect made me better than everyone around me, my world tilted on its axis. You you created it." "I was a professor at MIT, he continued, his eyes distant with memory. "I had 3 degrees, published papers, spoke 7 languages. I looked down on anyone who didn't match my academic achievements. I was, in every way that mattered, exactly like you. I felt like I was falling through space." This wasn't just some random street vendor who had gotten lucky. This was a man who had once stood where I stood, who had felt what I felt, who had been everything I thought made a person valuable. "What happened?" I whispered. The old man smiled sadly. "I met someone who taught me the same lesson I'm teaching you. Someone who showed me that true wisdom has nothing to do with degrees or bank accounts or the ability to look down on others. But the most devastating revelation was still to come. And when he spoke again, it would force me to question everything I thought I knew about intelligence, worth, and what it truly means to live a meaningful life." "The person who taught me this lesson," the old man continued, his voice heavy with emotion, "was a janitor at the university. His name was Thomas, and everyone treated him like he was invisible. Professors walked past him without acknowledgement. Students made jokes about his simple way of speaking. I listened in stunned silence as he continued. One day, I found Thomas in my office after hours. He was looking at equations I had written on my whiteboard, complex calculus that had taken me hours to work through. I was furious. How dared this uneducated man touch my work? But then Thomas pointed to an error in my calculation, something so subtle that none of my graduate students had caught it. The old man paused, lost in the memory. I was humiliated. I demanded to know how someone without formal education could spot a mistake that PhD candidates had missed. And do you know what Thomas told me? He looked directly into my eyes. He said, "Professor, you're so busy being smart that you forgot to be wise. You see numbers and formulas, but I see patterns and relationships. You use your mind, but I use my heart." I felt tears running down my cheeks now, ruining my expensive makeup completely. That's when I realized that I had spent my entire life measuring intelligence by the wrong standards. Thomas couldn't write a research paper, but he could see solutions that eluded brilliant minds. He couldn't speak eloquently at conferences, but he could offer comfort to a struggling student with just a few simple words. He didn't have degrees hanging on his wall, but he had wisdom that came from living, from caring, from connecting with other human beings. The weight of his words was crushing me, forcing me to confront the emptiness at the core of my existence. But he wasn't finished with me yet. After that encounter with Thomas, I started paying attention to people I had always ignored. The cafeteria worker who remembered everyone's name and asked about their families. The security guard who stayed late to help students who were locked out of their dorms. The maintenance staff who worked tirelessly to keep the university running, while professors like me took all the credit. I was sobbing now, understanding flooding through me like a dam breaking. I realized that I had confused information with wisdom, academic achievement with human worth. I had spent decades accumulating knowledge while remaining ignorant about the most important things in life: compassion, empathy, genuine connection with other people. The old man reached across the table and gently touched my hand. So I left the university. I gave up my tenure, my research grants, my position. I spent the next 4 decades learning what Thomas had tried to teach me: that true intelligence isn't about being superior to others. It's about understanding our connection to each other, about using whatever gifts we have to lift others up rather than to put them down. "But your mansion," he said softly. "I don't want it. I never wanted it. This was never about winning your property." I looked up at him through my tears, confused. "Then what was this about?" The old man smiled with infinite kindness. "This was about giving you the same gift Thomas gave me, the chance to discover who you really are when you strip away all the things you think make you special." But what he said next would complete my transformation and give me a new understanding of what it truly means to be successful in life. "Victoria," the old man said, his voice filled with warmth, "you don't need to give me your mansion, but you do need to ask yourself what you're going to do with this moment of clarity." I wiped my eyes with the back of my hand, not caring anymore about my appearance. "I don't know," I admitted. "I feel like everything I thought I knew about myself was wrong." "Not wrong," he corrected gently. "Incomplete. You are intelligent. You are capable. You do have gifts. But you've been using those gifts to separate yourself from others instead of connecting with them." He stood up from his chair and began carefully packing his puzzles into the wooden box. "Thomas taught me that the highest form of intelligence is wisdom, and wisdom begins with humility. The moment you stop needing to be better than everyone else is the moment you can start becoming genuinely useful to them." I watched him prepare to leave, and suddenly panic set in. "Wait," I called out. "I need to know more. I need to understand how to change." The old man paused and smiled. "You've already started changing, Victoria. The moment you admitted you couldn't solve the puzzle, the moment you stopped insisting on your superiority, you took the first step toward wisdom." He reached into his box and pulled out a simple wooden puzzle, not the complex one I had failed to solve, but something smaller, more manageable. "This one," he said, placing it in my hands, "can be solved, but not with your mind alone. You have to solve it with your heart." As he walked away, I called after him, "What's your name?" He turned back with a smile that seemed to contain all the warmth in the world. "My name is Thomas," he said. "I was named after my father, the janitor who saved my soul." And in that moment, everything finally made perfect sense. I stood there, on that street corner for another hour, holding Thomas's simple puzzle in my hands, and slowly, without forcing it, without trying to prove anything, the pieces began to fit together. Not because I was smart enough to solve it, but because I finally stopped trying so hard to be smart. When the puzzle clicked into place, I felt something I had never experienced before, not the satisfaction of being superior to someone else, but the quiet joy of understanding something beautiful. That evening, I drove home to my mansion and really looked at it for the first time. All those rooms, all that space, all that luxury, and I lived there, completely alone. I had wealth, but no wisdom, success, but no connection, intelligence, but no understanding of what truly mattered. The next morning, I did something that would have been unthinkable just 24 hours earlier. I called the local homeless shelter and offered to host a holiday dinner in my mansion, not as charity that would make me feel superior, but as an opportunity to learn from people whose experiences were different from mine. That dinner changed my life. More than my Harvard degree ever did. I met a former teacher who had lost her job due to budget cuts, a veteran struggling with PTSD, a teenager who had aged out of foster care. Each person had stories that revealed depths of wisdom I had never imagined. I realized that Thomas had given me the most valuable gift possible, not just humility, but the capacity to see the extraordinary intelligence that exists in every human being, the street vendor's wisdom, the janitor's insights, the homeless shelter resident's resilience. These were forms of intelligence that no university could teach. Today, I still run my family's business, but I run it differently. One, listen more than I speak. I learn from my employees rather than just managing them. I use my resources to create opportunities for others rather than to elevate myself above them. And sometimes, when I'm walking through downtown, I stop to talk with street vendors, not to test them or prove my superiority, but to learn what they might teach me about life, about wisdom, about what it truly means to be intelligent. Because I finally understand that the smartest thing any of us can do is admit how much we still have to learn. 6 months after my encounter with Thomas, I made a decision that shocked everyone who knew me. I established a foundation dedicated to supporting street entrepreneurs and displaced academics, people whose intelligence and talents were being overlooked by society. But more than that, I became a student again, not in a classroom, but in the real world. I started volunteering at literacy programs, where I met a woman named Maria, who had never learned to read but possessed an intuitive understanding of mathematics that amazed me. She could calculate complex percentages in her head while helping customers at her small grocery store. But because she lacked formal education, no one had ever recognized her gift. I met James, a homeless veteran who had an encyclopedic knowledge of history and current events from years of reading discarded newspapers and books. His insights into political and social issues were more nuanced than anything I had heard in my business meetings. Yet society had written him off as worthless. These encounters taught me that intelligence comes in countless forms, and our education system, the same system that had made me feel superior, was actually blind to most of them. I had been measuring intelligence by a single, narrow standard, while ignoring the vast spectrum of human capability and wisdom. The foundation grew beyond my wildest expectations, but not because of my business acumen. It grew because I finally learned to listen, to collaborate, to recognize that my role wasn't to be the smartest person in the room, but to create space for others to share their unique forms of intelligence. Thomas had given me more than humility. He had given me the ability to see clearly for the first time in my life. But the most profound change wasn't in how I viewed others. It was in how I viewed myself. I began to understand that my desperate need to feel superior had been masking a deep insecurity. All my life, I had been terrified of being ordinary, of not mattering, of not being special. So, I had built walls of achievement and wealth to protect myself from that fear. Walls that ultimately imprisoned me in isolation and arrogance. Thomas's lesson hadn't just taught me about humility. It had freed me from the exhausting burden of constantly proving my worth. For the first time, I could simply be present with other people without needing to establish my superiority over them. This freedom transformed every relationship in my life. I reached out to family members I had alienated with my condescension. I apologized to former employees I had treated poorly. I began forming genuine friendships based on mutual respect rather than the admiration of people who wanted access to my wealth and connections. One day, while volunteering at a community center, I met a little girl named Sarah who was struggling with her homework. She was frustrated and close to tears, insisting that she was too stupid for math. I sat down beside her, and instead of lecturing her about the importance of education or showing off my own mathematical knowledge, I simply asked her to show me what she was working on. As we worked through the problems together, I saw myself, at her age, bright, capable, but already learning to measure my worth by my ability to outperform others. I realized that Thomas's gift to me needed to be passed forward, that every interaction I had was an opportunity to either lift someone up or tear them down. "You're not stupid, Sarah," I told her gently. "You're learning, and learning means making mistakes and figuring things out step by step. The smartest thing you can do is ask for help when you need it." In that moment, I was no longer the arrogant heiress who had approached Thomas's table. I had become the person he had seen in me all along. A year later, I found myself back on that same downtown street corner where my transformation had begun. I wasn't looking for Thomas. I had accepted that our encounter might have been a once-in-a-lifetime moment. But as I walked past the spot where his table had been, I noticed something that made my heart skip a beat. There was a small bronze plaque embedded in the sidewalk, so subtle that most people probably walked right over it without noticing. The inscription was simple: "In memory of Thomas Martinez, janitor, teacher, and friend to all who needed wisdom, 1943 to 2019. I knelt down and traced the letters with my fingers, tears flowing freely. Thomas had died just months before our encounter, according to the dates, but that was impossible. I had spoken with him, touched his puzzles, learned from his wisdom. How could he have been dead? A voice behind me said gently, "You knew him, too." I turned to see an elderly woman watching me with knowing eyes. "He was my father," she continued. "He told me before he died that he would find a way to continue teaching, even after he was gone. He said there were still people who needed to learn what he had learned." I stared at her in shock, trying to process what this meant. "The puzzles," I whispered. "They were real. I held them in my hands." She smiled. "My father believed that love and wisdom could transcend physical limitations. He spent his last months creating those puzzles and writing letters to people he had never met but somehow knew needed his guidance." She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope with my name written on it in familiar handwriting. "He asked me to give this to you when you came back. He said you would come back, and you would be ready to understand." My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter in Thomas's careful script. "Dear Victoria, if you are reading this, it means you have taken the first steps on a journey that will last the rest of your life. The puzzle I gave you was never about testing your intelligence. It was about awakening your humanity. I knew you would struggle with it, just as I struggled 43 years ago when my father first challenged my assumptions about worth and wisdom. You see, the story I told you about being a professor was true, but incomplete. The janitor who taught me humility wasn't named Thomas. He was my father, and his name was Roberto Martinez. When I was young and arrogant like you, I was ashamed of my father's work. I changed my name from Roberto Martinez Jr. to Robert Thomas when I entered academia, wanting to distance myself from what I saw as his simple life. It took me decades to understand that he was the wisest person I had ever known, and by the time I realized it, he had already passed away. I spent the rest of my life trying to honor his memory by passing on the lessons he taught me. I left the university not because of a sudden revelation, but because I wanted to meet people where they were, to learn from them as my father had learned from everyone he encountered. The puzzle you couldn't solve represents the complexity of human connection. It can't be mastered through intellect alone because it requires something far more valuable: the willingness to be vulnerable, to admit you don't have all the answers, to see others as teachers rather than inferiors. Victoria, you have gifts that can change the world, but only if you use them to build bridges instead of walls. The greatest intelligence is knowing that there is always more to learn, and the greatest wisdom is understanding that every person you meet has something to teach you. The letter continued, but I had to stop reading because I was crying too hard to see the words clearly. I wiped my eyes and continued reading. "I want you to know that our encounter was not supernatural, though it may have seemed that way. Love has a way of transcending death, not through ghostly appearances, but through the ripple effects of wisdom passed from one person to another. My father taught me, I taught you, and now you will teach others. The puzzles you held, the conversation we shared, the transformation you experienced, these were all real because the love and wisdom behind them are real. When someone dies, having lived a life of service and teaching, they don't simply vanish, they become part of the fabric of human connection, continuing to influence and guide through the people they touched. You asked me once how long it took me to learn to solve the puzzle. The truth is, I never completely solved it. The puzzle of human connection, of true wisdom, of living with humility and compassion. These are challenges we work on every day of our lives. They don't have final solutions, only deeper understanding. But here's what I discovered. The joy isn't in solving the puzzle perfectly. The joy is in working on it alongside other people, learning from their perspectives, celebrating their insights, and accepting that their ways of thinking might be different from yours, but equally valid. Victoria. You have been given a second chance to live your life with purpose. Don't waste it trying to prove your superiority. Use it to discover the extraordinary, ordinary wisdom that exists in every human being you encounter. Remember, the smartest person in any room is usually the one who knows how much they still have to learn. The letter was signed simply, with love and gratitude. Thomas Roberto Martinez Jr. At the bottom was a postscript that made me smile through my tears. P.S. The simple puzzle I gave you, keep it. And when you meet someone who needs to learn what you have learned, pass it on. Thomas's daughter, whose name was Carmen, invited me to have coffee with her. As we sat in a small cafe near the corner where I had met her father, she told me more about the man who had changed my life. He spent his last 5 years creating those puzzles and writing letters to people he had never met, Carmen explained. He would sit in parks and watch people, and somehow he could tell who was struggling with arrogance or loneliness, or the need to feel superior. He wrote dozens of letters to people he called future students. How did he know to give me your name? I asked, still amazed by the precision of the encounter. Carmen smiled. He researched you. He read about your business dealings, your charitable contributions, or lack thereof, and your reputation around town. But more than that, he saw something in you that reminded him of himself at your age. He said you had the hunger for superiority that masks a deep fear of insignificance. Those were his exact words. I felt exposed, as if Thomas had seen straight through to my core even before we met. He was right, I admitted. I was terrified of being ordinary, of not mattering. I built my entire identity around being better than everyone else. My father understood that fear intimately, Carmen continued. He told me that the people who need humility lessons the most are often the ones who are most afraid of being vulnerable, of admitting they don't know everything. He said that true compassion meant seeing through people's arrogance to the scared child underneath. She pulled out a small leather journal, worn smooth by years of handling. This contains all the letters he wrote, but never sent, all the people he observed but never approached, all the wisdom he wanted to share but couldn't figure out how to deliver. He gave it to me with instructions to continue his work in whatever way felt right. I opened the journal and immediately recognized Thomas's careful handwriting. The pages were filled with observations about human nature, insights about the different forms intelligence could take, and detailed character studies of people he had encountered. One entry made me gasp. Victoria Hamilton, age 28, inherited wealth, Harvard MBA. Walks like she owns the world, but her eyes showed desperate need for validation. Reminds me of myself at that age, intelligent but not wise, successful but not fulfilled, educated but not understanding the most important lessons about what makes life meaningful. She needs to learn that intelligence without empathy is just sophisticated ignorance, and that true wisdom begins with admitting how much we don't know. The accuracy of his assessment was breathtaking and humbling. He had seen me more clearly in a few observations than I had seen myself in 28 years of living. There's something else, Carmen said, her voice growing serious. My father didn't just leave letters for people like you, he left instructions for them too, guidance on how to continue his work, how to pass on the lessons they learned. She reached into her bag and pulled out another envelope, this one sealed with red wax. He said to give you this only after you had read his first letter and understood what really happened in your encounter with him. My hands shook as I broke the seal. Inside was a detailed plan, written in Thomas's meticulous handwriting, outlining what he called the Wisdom Project. It wasn't just about teaching humility to arrogant people. It was about creating a network of individuals who had learned to see beyond surface appearances, who could recognize and nurture the hidden intelligence in everyone they met. He believed, Carmen explained as I read, that the world's problems stemmed from people's inability to recognize the value and wisdom in others who are different from themselves. Rich people looked down on poor people. Educated people dismissed those without formal schooling. Young people ignore the elderly. Healthy people avoid those with disabilities. Everyone creating hierarchies instead of connections. The plan was both simple and revolutionary. Those who had learned Thomas's lessons were meant to become wisdom bridges, people who could translate between different types of intelligence, who could help others see the value in perspectives they had previously dismissed, who could break down the barriers that separated people from recognizing their common humanity. But there's a responsibility that comes with this, Carmen warned. Once you truly understand what my father taught, you can't go back to seeing people as inferior or superior. You can't unsee the extraordinary intelligence that exists in every human being. It changes how you live every single day for the rest of your life. I thought about the past year of my life, how every interaction had become richer, how every encounter had become an opportunity to learn something new, how my definition of success had completely transformed from being the smartest person in the room to being the person who could help others recognize their own unique forms of intelligence. I'm ready, I told her, though I wasn't entirely sure what I was committing myself to. What did your father want me to do next? Carmen's smile held both pride and sadness. He wanted you to find someone just like you used to be, someone intelligent and capable but trapped by their own arrogance and fear of insignificance. Someone who needs to learn that true wisdom comes not from being superior to others, but from recognizing the extraordinary value in every person they encounter. She paused, studying my face carefully. But he also warned that this wouldn't be easy. The people who most need these lessons are often the most resistant to learning them. They're scared, just like you were scared, of discovering that their entire identity is built on false foundations. As I absorbed the weight of what she was telling me, I realized that Thomas's gift to me had been even greater than I had understood. He hadn't just taught me humility, he had given me a purpose, a way to transform my own painful learning experience into a source of healing and growth for others. How will I know when I find the right person? I asked. Carmen laughed, and for a moment she sounded exactly like her father. Oh, you'll know. They'll be just like you were, successful, educated, absolutely convinced of their own superiority, and completely blind to the wisdom that surrounds them every day, and probably just as terrified as you were of admitting they might be wrong about everything they thought they knew about intelligence and were. 2 months later, I found him. His name was Jonathan, and he was everything I had once been: arrogant, dismissive, completely convinced that his Ivy League education and successful career in investment banking made him superior to the common people he encountered in his daily life. I was volunteering at a community center, helping with a financial literacy workshop for small business owners and aspiring entrepreneurs. Jonathan had been court-ordered to complete community service hours after a DUI incident, and his contempt for the entire situation was obvious from the moment he walked in. I can't believe I have to waste my Saturday teaching basic math to people who couldn't figure out how to manage money if their lives depended on it, he muttered to another volunteer, loud enough for several of the participants to hear. I watched as faces around the room fell, as people who had been excited to learn suddenly looked ashamed and embarrassed. These were hardworking individuals who had never had access to formal financial education, people who were trying to improve their lives and build better futures for their families. And Jonathan's casual cruelty was destroying their confidence before the workshop had even begun. But instead of confronting him directly, I remembered Thomas's approach. He had seen through my arrogance to the fear underneath. He had challenged me not with anger, but with wisdom, not with condescension, but with compassion. During the lunch break, I approached Jonathan with what I hoped looked like genuine curiosity. You seem to have a lot of experience in finance, I said. I'm wondering if you might help me with something I've been puzzling over. His chest puffed up with pride. Of course, what's the problem? I pulled out a small notebook, not one of Thomas's wooden puzzles, but something equally challenging in its own way. I've been working with a small business owner who wants to expand her catering company. She has excellent customer relationships and a solid reputation, but she's struggling to understand how to structure her financing in a way that won't put her family's home at risk. Jonathan glanced at my notes dismissively. Simple. She needs to establish proper business credit, separate her personal and business finances, maybe look into SBA loans or angel investors. Basic Business 101. Right, I said slowly, but here's what's interesting. She's been running this business successfully for 8 years without any formal business education. She's never missed a payment to suppliers, never had a dissatisfied customer, never failed to meet a deadline. She's built something sustainable and profitable, using intelligence that wasn't learned in any classroom. Jonathan's expression began to shift slightly, though he was still defensive. Well, sure, some people get lucky, but that doesn't mean, actually, I interrupted gently, I don't think it's luck. I think she understands things about customer relationships, about quality, control, about managing cash flow in a seasonal business that most MBA programs don't teach. The question is, how do we help her translate that intuitive knowledge into formal structures without losing the wisdom that made her successful in the first place? For the first time since he'd arrived, Jonathan looked genuinely thoughtful instead of dismissive. I hadn't considered that perspective, he admitted reluctantly. What if I told you, I continued, that this woman, Maria, the one I mentioned, has insights about risk management that could benefit some of your high-end investment clients? What if the intelligence that built her business from nothing could teach you something new about sustainable growth strategies? I could see the same struggle in Jonathan's eyes that I had felt when Thomas first challenged my assumptions, the cognitive dissonance of recognizing intelligence in someone he had been trained to dismiss, the uncomfortable realization that his definitions of worth and capability might be too narrow. But unlike my encounter with Thomas, this conversation was just the beginning. Jonathan wasn't ready for dramatic transformation yet. He was still too invested in his identity as someone superior to others. What he needed was time, patience, and repeated exposure to examples of intelligence that didn't fit his narrow definitions. Over the following weeks, I made sure Jonathan encountered more people like Maria, individuals whose lack of formal education masked extraordinary practical wisdom, whose different life experiences had given them insights that complemented rather than competed with traditional academic knowledge. The breakthrough came 6 weeks later, during what started as a routine evening at the community center. Jonathan had been grudgingly participating in the financial literacy workshops, still maintaining his superior attitude but beginning to show grudging respect for some of the participants' practical knowledge. That night, we were working with a group of immigrant entrepreneurs who were trying to navigate the complexities of American business regulations while building companies that served their communities. Jonathan was explaining tax implications for small businesses, his tone still somewhat condescending but less openly hostile than it had been initially. One of the participants, an older man named Ahmed, who ran a small grocery store, raised his hand. "Excuse me, sir, but I am wondering about something. You say we should maximize deductions, but what about building relationships with tax authorities? In my country, we learn that sometimes paying a little more in taxes, being very transparent, creates trust that is worth more than money saved." Jonathan's first instinct was clearly to dismiss this as naive thinking from someone who didn't understand American business practices, but something made him pause. Maybe it was the weeks of exposure to unconventional wisdom, or maybe it was the genuine respect in Ahmed's voice, despite the language barrier. "What do you mean exactly?" Jonathan asked, and I could hear the shift in his tone, from condescending professor to curious colleague. Ahmed's face lit up. "In my store, I serve many customers who struggle with English, who are afraid of government, who have bad experiences with authority. When tax inspector comes to my store, she sees that my books are clean, my reporting is honest, even when I could hide some cash income. She begins to trust me." He paused, searching for the right words to express a complex concept in his second language. "Now, when my customers have tax problems, inspector suggests they come to me for help understanding forms. I translate, I explain, I help them stay compliant. This brings more customers to my store, builds stronger relationships in community. The extra tax I pay is investment in trust, in reputation, in community standing." Jonathan stared at Ahmed for a long moment, and I could see his mind working. Here was a sophisticated understanding of long-term business strategy, community building, and risk management expressed by someone whose English was imperfect but whose grasp of complex relationship dynamics was extraordinary. "That's," Jonathan started, then stopped. "That's actually brilliant. You're talking about building social capital that converts to economic value over time. Most of my clients never think beyond the next quarter's numbers." Ahmed smiled broadly. "Yes, exactly. Long-term thinking, community investment, but also," he added with a twinkle in his eye, "you use big words for simple ideas. Maybe sometimes simple words carry more wisdom than complicated ones." The room erupted in gentle laughter, but it wasn't mocking. It was the warm laughter of recognition, of seeing someone's rigid worldview crack open just enough to let in new light. Jonathan laughed too, but I could see something fundamental shifting in his expression. The same look of disorientation and discovery that I had felt when Thomas first challenged my assumptions about intelligence and worth. After the workshop ended, Jonathan approached me with questions that I recognized all too well. How did Ahmed develop that level of strategic thinking without formal business education? Why didn't I learn about community-based business models in my MBA program? What else am I missing because I've been looking in the wrong places for intelligence and insight? I smiled, remembering how Thomas had responded to my similar questions, with patience and wisdom rather than answers. What if, I suggested, instead of me telling you what you're missing, you spent some time discovering it for yourself? What if you approached people like Ahmed, not as students to be taught, but as teachers who might have something valuable to share with you? The transformation wouldn't happen overnight. Mine hadn't either. But Jonathan was beginning the same journey that Thomas had started me on, the journey from arrogance to wisdom, from superiority to connection, from seeing others as inferior to recognizing the extraordinary intelligence that existed in every person he encountered. Over the next 3 months, I watched Jonathan undergo the same painful and beautiful transformation I had experienced. He began seeking out conversations with people he had previously dismissed: the janitor in his office building who had managed to send 3 children to college on a modest salary, the food truck owner who had built a successful business with new startup capital, the elderly woman who cleaned houses and seemed to understand human nature better than any psychologist he had ever met. Each encounter chipped away at his certainty, his need to feel superior, his narrow definitions of intelligence and success. I could see him struggling with the same cognitive dissonance I had faced. The uncomfortable realization that his expensive education had taught him a great deal about manipulating numbers and markets, but very little about understanding people, building community, or finding meaning in life. The pivotal moment came during a community event where local business owners were sharing their success stories. Jonathan had been asked to speak about traditional financing options, but instead of his usual lecture about proper business practices, he spent most of his time asking questions and listening to answers. When Maria, the catering business owner, described how she had weathered the economic downturn by creating a network of mutual support among local restaurants, Jonathan raised his hand. "Maria," he said, and his voice carried none of its former condescension, "what you're describing sounds like a sophisticated risk distribution strategy. Have you ever considered that you might be able to teach business schools about sustainable growth models based on community interdependence rather than competitive advantage?" Maria looked puzzled. "I don't understand the big words," she said honestly, "but I know that when my neighbor succeeds, I succeed. When she struggles, I help her, because tomorrow I might need help. It's not strategy, it's just ... how community works." Jonathan nodded slowly, and I could see the wheels turning in his mind. "That's exactly what I mean," he said. "You've identified something that most business theorists miss, that sustainable success comes from building others up rather than competing them down. You've created a model that prioritizes collective prosperity over individual dominance." Then he paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was humble in a way I had never heard before. "I'm wondering if you might be willing to teach me more about how this works in practice. I think I have a lot to learn from your approach." The room went quiet. Here was a man who had entered this community looking down on everyone present, now genuinely asking to learn from someone whose lack of formal education he had initially dismissed. The transformation was so complete that several people looked shocked, but Maria just smiled warmly. "Of course, mijo. But first, you have to understand, this isn't about being smart or not smart. It's about remembering that we're all connected, that other people's success makes our own success possible. You can't learn community from books, you have to live it." After the event ended, Jonathan approached me with tears in his eyes. "I've been such a fool," he said quietly. "I thought intelligence was about knowing more than other people, being better than them. But these people, they understand things about life, about relationships, about what actually matters that I never learned despite all my education." I put a hand on his shoulder, remembering how lost and confused I had felt during my own transformation. "The good news," I told him, "is that recognizing your ignorance is the first step toward wisdom. Thomas taught me that the smartest thing we can do is admit how much we still have to learn." "Thomas?" Jonathan looked puzzled. I smiled, realizing it was time to share the story that had started my own journey toward understanding. Let me tell you about a street vendor who changed my life, and a lesson about intelligence that no university could ever teach. As I told Jonathan about my encounter with Thomas, I watched his face go through the same emotional journey I had experienced: disbelief, recognition, humility, and finally, a deep understanding of how much his worldview needed to change. When I finished, he sat in silence for several minutes, processing everything I had shared. "So this, Thomas," Jonathan said finally, "he was already dead when you met him, according to the dates on the memorial plaque." "Yes. But the wisdom he shared, the lessons he taught, the transformation he sparked, those were completely real." That's the thing about genuine wisdom. It transcends individual lives. When someone truly understands how to help others grow and change, that understanding becomes part of something larger than themselves. Jonathan nodded slowly. "Like what you're doing with me now. You're passing on what he taught you." "Exactly. And someday, when you've fully integrated these lessons, you'll find someone who needs to learn what you've learned. The wisdom keeps moving, keeps growing, keeps touching new lives." I pulled out the simple wooden puzzle Thomas had given me, the one I had solved not through intellectual force but through patience and heart. "He left me this," I said, placing it in Jonathan's hands, "and now I think it's meant for you." Jonathan examined the puzzle carefully, turning it over in his hands. Unlike the impossible complexity of the puzzle Thomas had first shown me, this one was elegant in its simplicity. Not easy, but approachable. Not designed to frustrate, but to teach. "What am I supposed to learn from this?" he asked. "The same thing I learned," I replied, "that the most important solutions can't be forced. They require patience, intuition, and the willingness to approach problems with your heart as well as your mind. Try to solve it using only logic, and you'll struggle. But if you can let go of your need to dominate the puzzle, if you can work with it instead of against it, the solution will reveal itself." Over the following weeks, I watched Jonathan carry that puzzle with him everywhere. He would work on it during breaks at the office, fiddle with it while waiting for meetings to start, contemplate it during quiet moments at home. And slowly, just as Thomas had intended, the puzzle began teaching him lessons that went far beyond arranging wooden pieces. "I'm starting to understand," Jonathan told me one afternoon. "When I try to force the pieces into place, when I approach it like a problem to be conquered, nothing works. But when I slow down, when I really pay attention to the shape and feel of each piece, when I stop trying so hard to be clever, I can sense where things belong." "And how does that apply to working with people?" I asked. Jonathan's smile was the smile of someone discovering a profound truth. "It's the same thing, isn't it? When I approach people as problems to be solved or competitions to be won, I miss everything important about them. But when I slow down, when I really listen, when I stop trying to prove I'm smarter than them, I can start to understand the unique intelligence they bring to every situation." He paused, studying the partially completed puzzle in his hands. "Maria doesn't think about business strategy the way I was taught to think about it. But her understanding of how to build sustainable relationships is more sophisticated than anything I learned in business school. Ahmed's approach to community building would never work in a corporate environment, but it creates the kind of loyalty and trust that most companies spend millions trying to achieve." "Exactly," I said. "Different types of intelligence, different approaches to problem solving, different but equally valid ways of understanding how the world works." Jonathan finally solved the puzzle 3 days later. When he brought it to me, completed and glowing with quiet satisfaction, his eyes held the same peaceful confidence I had felt when I first understood Thomas's lesson. "I'm ready," he said simply. "I understand now what you mean about seeing intelligence everywhere. I understand that my education gave me tools, but wisdom comes from recognizing that other people have different tools that are just as valuable, maybe more valuable, for certain problems." I nodded, feeling the deep satisfaction that comes from watching someone complete a difficult but necessary journey. "So what happens next?" Jonathan's transformation was complete, but his real work was just beginning. Like me, he had to learn how to live differently in the world, how to interact with people from his new perspective of humility and respect, rather than his old perspective of superiority and competition. He started small, just as I had. He began really listening to his colleagues instead of waiting for his turn to demonstrate his intelligence. He asked questions about their perspectives instead of assuming his viewpoint was automatically superior. He sought out opportunities to learn from people whose backgrounds and experiences were different from his own. The changes in his professional life were remarkable. His investment strategies became more nuanced because he was incorporating insights from entrepreneurs who had built successful businesses through community relationships rather than pure capital optimization. His client relationships improved dramatically because he was finally seeing his clients as whole human beings with complex needs rather than just sources of revenue. But the most significant change was in how he saw his role in the world. Like me, Jonathan had been using his intelligence and education to separate himself from others, to establish his superiority, to protect his ego from the fear of being ordinary. Now he was learning to use those same gifts to build bridges, to translate between different types of intelligence, to help others recognize and develop their own unique capabilities. 6 months after Jonathan solved Thomas's puzzle, he called me with excitement in his voice. "I found her," he said. "I found someone who needs to learn what I learned." Her name was Catherine, and she was a brilliant surgeon who had developed the same arrogance about intellectual superiority that had once characterized both Jonathan and me. She looked down on nurses as mere technicians, dismissed patients' concerns as ignorance, and generally treated anyone without her level of medical education as intellectually inferior. "She reminds me so much of myself," Jonathan told me. Brilliant, accomplished, completely convinced that her expertise makes her better than everyone around her, and completely blind to all the forms of intelligence that don't match her narrow definition. "What's your plan?" I asked, remembering how carefully Thomas had crafted our encounter to maximum learning potential. "I'm thinking of starting where you started with me," Jonathan said. "Gentle exposure to people whose intelligence doesn't fit academic models. The hospital where she works has an incredible volunteer program, people who understand patient care, family dynamics, emotional support in ways that medical school never teaches. And then I introduce her to someone like Maria or Ahmed. People whose wisdom about human nature and community building could actually make her a better doctor, if she's willing to learn, and if she's ready." He paused, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "I have a puzzle for her to try." I felt a deep warmth spreading through my chest. Thomas's wisdom was multiplying, reaching people he had never met, touching lives he had never directly encountered. The ripple effects of his simple lesson about humility and human connection were expanding in ways that would have made him proud. "You know what this means, don't you?" one asked Jonathan. "It means I'm becoming who Thomas always knew I could become," he replied. "Someone who uses intelligence to build others up instead of putting them down. Someone who sees learning opportunities in every person I meet. Someone who understands that the smartest thing anyone can do is admit how much they still have to learn from others,